Our Bible studies actually on. Hello again. It's Shaw here with the next instalment of our Bible studies actually on the Bible itself. And we're looking at how people got to know about who Jesus was. And whilst the first people would have seen him on his missionary activity, going around teaching and preaching, others would have come across him after his death and resurrection through the churches that the disciples had set up, through the letters that the disciples wrote to the churches to encourage them after they had moved on, and also from those people who within those churches began to write down the story of Jesus, bearing in mind that, well, not all of them would be alive, and so they needed to have a record. And we've looked at Matthew, Mark and Luke as three Gospels which had different sources to put it together. How Mark had written originally, Matthew and Luke had pinched quite a lot from him, and they'd also got their own materials. We looked at Mark last time, and that's available still on YouTube if you're desperate. And today I want us to have a look at why Matthew wrote what he wrote. And I want to start the story by doing what we did with Mark and asking, well, to whom was he writing? And if you look at Matthew chapter 18, there is a phrase in there which is a giveaway. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. And there you have it. Some teaching for the church. Full stop. Nowhere else does Jesus use the word church. And the thought is that Matthew selects this material because he is writing for a church. In fact, it's quite clear that there are probably 4 main reasons that we can tell this. Because partly it's teaching, what the technical word is catechetical, but it's basically providing teaching for new disciples. Secondly, it's liturgical. It follows the seasons of the year, for example, so you know how to understand Christmas or Lent or Easter. And it also provides the words of the Lord's Prayer, and the Beatitudes are presented in a particular way. Blessed is, etc., etc. The third thing is that the way it's arranged means that you've got readings that you can have in the same way that we have readings in church. We call it a lectionary, and the readings seem to fit that pattern. And as I've already suggested, it was written to help with church order and discipline. So for teaching, for the church's worship, for the church's Bible reading, and for the way the church was run and organised. Can we find any more clues about this church? Well, indeed we can, because in it, Matthew is very keen to explain that this life of Jesus is a fulfilment of what the Old Testament had taught. In fact, he quotes the Old Testament quite often, but he doesn't explain things in the same way that Mark and Luke do. So he assumes that his Jewish audience understands the idea. He probably wrote it as well to demonstrate the authenticity of Jesus. That's why he starts off with the genealogy of taking Jesus back through Joseph, interestingly, to David and then to Abraham. And if you look at the story of the birth of Jesus, he perhaps only had one story he could choose, but the one that he does tell us about is the Kings. And in that story, he also links the birth of Jesus to the stories in the Old Testament, that the prophecy of Micah chapter 5 reveals that he's going to be born in Bethlehem, and that's what the wise men discover when they go to Jerusalem to find out where the Saviour is to be born. And secondly, the fact that Mary, Joseph and Jesus had to flee to Egypt is linked to "Out of Egypt I called my son," which is a direct quote from Hosea chapter 11. The other thing that Matthew seems to do is concentrate on the teaching of Jesus. He wants to make it very clear the Sermon on the Mount is breathtaking. And remember, that's the story that finishes with the story of the house builders. One who builds his house on sand, the other who builds it on rock. And of course, when the storms come, the one that's built on a poorer foundation doesn't survive. And that ends what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew may have cheated here. It does seem, according to him, that Jesus did all this in one sitting. I rather suspect that he's put together different strands and lumped it all together in the Sermon on the Mount. Luke does something similar with the Sermon on the Plain, by the way. But it's breathtaking because not only got the Beatitudes, true happiness, blessed is, but he's teaching about salt and light, the law, teaching about anger, adultery, divorce, vows, revenge, enemies, charity, prayer. And then it's about fasting and riches and being the light of the body, judging others and asking, seeking and knocking. It's a very lengthy section. And that's important to Matthew because he wants his church to know about it. And now just a few final words about who Matthew himself was. Traditionally, it was assumed to be Matthew the tax collector, one of the disciples of Jesus, and certainly he was probably able to read and write and may have written down one or two notes which were passed on. But generally it's felt that it's written after Mark, and the frequent references to the Old Testament seem to draw on a famous Greek translation of the Old Testament, what's called the Septuagint, rather than the Hebrew one. So that would suggest that it's got slightly later ideas coming through. It could well be that Matthew had created a tradition, and a lot of scholars talk about the school of Matthew, where they used the ideas that had come perhaps from the fragments, but also, to be honest, if they called it Matthew's Gospel and associated it with the disciple who was the tax collector, then it gave it a bit more authority in people's minds. Certainly the early church fathers tended to look at Matthew as probably the main gospel in some ways, and they certainly believed it was the first to have been written. So how can we sum up Matthew? Well, there he is, one of my fantastic drawings. And he was concerned, first of all, about new disciples. He was providing teaching for new Christians. Secondly, he was providing guidance for worship, the liturgy of Christmas and Easter and the period of Advent, as well as the words of the Lord's Prayer. The third thing he does is provide a systematic scheme to read the Bible, for believers to remind themselves using what we would call nowadays a lectionary. And finally, what he wanted to emphasise was that it was no good just having a faith. As good Jewish believers, keeping the law was actually one thing, but it had to be faith in lifestyle, which is why the Sermon on the Mount is well worth a read all the way through from time to time, just on its own. So there we go. Matthew, another of the writers of the New Testament. Well, I do hope that has proved helpful. If you've got any questions, please do come back to me. And next time, we'll be having a look at Dr. Luke and why he wrote about Jesus the way he did. Another way in which we find out about who Jesus was. In the meantime, look after yourselves. God bless you.